A pregnant widow tied to the auction block with a sign that read "Worthless." The crowd laughed. The sheriff sneered. Her life was about to be sold away until a scarred mountain man stepped forward, slapped down $1 silver, and did the unthinkable. He didn't buy her to shame her. He cut her free. He gave her his coat. And in that moment, the town's laughter turned to stunned silence. But in the ashes of that night, a darker truth came to light. Hidden in her late husband's ledger was proof of a crime that could tear the whole valley apart. Stolen land, stolen water, and blood on the hands of men sworn to protect the law. Now hunted, sheltering in a lonely cabin, the widow and the mountain man must stand against fire, betrayal, and the weight of a secret powerful men would kill to destroy. Can a woman the world called worthless, and a man who lost his faith, find the courage to fight for justice, a newborn child, and a second chance at love? Or will the frontier swallow them both before the dawn? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. Through the hazy morning light, the sun blazed harsh and unforgiving over the dusty streets of the Colorado mining town. The wooden auction block stood like an ugly scar in the town square, its rough planks weathered by seasons of rain and snow. Michael Dawson felt the coarse rope bite into her wrists as she stood there, her head bowed under the weight of shame and the cruel placard that hung around her neck. The word "worthless" seemed to burn against her threadbare dress. Her hands trembled as they rested protectively over her swollen belly. 6 months along, and here she stood like cattle for sale. The morning chill cut through her thin clothing, but it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was the eyes, dozens of them, boring into her from every direction. Sheriff Amos Cutter's voice boomed across the square, cutting through the whispers and jeers. $200 in railroad debt, folks. Her dead husband's crimes make her property of the law. He circled the platform like a hungry wolf, his badge glinting in the morning sun. Who'll give me $50 for this worthless woman? The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Women clutched their shawls tighter, turning away or whispering behind raised hands. Men spat in the dust, some laughing, others averting their eyes. The children stared openly, their faces a mixture of confusion and curiosity. $30? The sheriff's voice carried a note of mockery. Come now, surely she's worth that much to someone? Michael's cheeks burned with humiliation. She caught fragments of harsh whispers carried on the morning breeze. Railroad bookkeeper's widow? Probably helped him steal. Child ain't even born yet. At the edge of the crowd, partially hidden in the shadow of the general store's awning, stood a figure that seemed cut from different cloth than the townspeople. Robert Hale's scarred face remained impassive, but his eyes, sharp as a hawk's, never left the auction block. His buckskins and worn coat marked him as a mountain man, someone more at home in the wilderness than in town. $20? Sheriff Cutter was growing impatient. 10? The silence stretched thick and heavy. Michael's legs trembled beneath her, exhaustion and fear threatening to bring her to her knees. The baby kicked, as if sensing her distress, and she bit her lip to keep from crying out. Then came the sound, clear and sharp against the wooden planks. A single silver dollar spun on the platform before coming to rest at Michael's feet. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence. Robert Hale stepped forward, his movement deliberate as a mountain cat. His voice, rough from disuse, carried across the square. $1. Sheriff Cutter's face reddened. Now see here. $1, Robert repeated, louder this time. More than you've gotten from anyone else. His hand rested casual-like on his belt, near his knife handle. The meaning wasn't lost on anyone present. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, calculating. A tense moment passed before he forced a laugh. Sold! To the mountain man for $1. He spat the words like they tasted bitter. Robert climbed the 3 steps to the platform, his boots heavy on the wooden planks. Without ceremony, he drew his knife, causing several gasps from the crowd, and cut through Michael's bonds with 2 quick slashes. The placard fell away next. Michael rubbed her raw wrists, her legs barely holding her up. Robert shrugged off his worn coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth of it, and the faint smell of pine and wood smoke, enveloped her like a shield. "You're under my protection now," he muttered, quiet enough that only she could hear. His eyes met hers briefly, and in them she saw not ownership, but something else. Something that might have been kindness. The crowd parted like water as Robert guided her down the steps, one hand hovering near her elbow to steady her if needed. Michael kept her eyes forward, though she could feel the stares following them. Women who had turned away now watched openly. Men who had laughed fell silent. They walked past the stunned faces, past the general store with its mourning customers frozen in the doorway, past the telegraph office where the operator had stopped his clicking to stare. The dust swirled around their feet as they made their way to the edge of town. Robert's horse stood waiting, a sturdy bay with patient eyes. Michael's steps faltered as they approached. Her heart hammered in her chest as the reality of her situation settled in. She had been sold to this scarred stranger who lived in the wilderness. Was this rescue, or something else entirely? She felt his presence beside her, solid but not threatening. He hadn't spoken more than those few words, but something in the careful way he moved, the respect in his silence, told her more than speeches could have. The morning sun continued its climb into the Colorado sky, casting long shadows behind them as they stood by the horse. Ahead lay the wilderness, behind them the town that had turned its back on a widow in need. Michael drew Robert's coat tighter around her shoulders, gathering what courage she could find. The unknown waited before her, but somehow it seemed less frightening than what she was leaving behind. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rutted road as Robert Hale led his bay horse westward, away from the mining town. Michael Dawson sat perched in the saddle, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other gripping the worn leather reins. Robert's coat still hung around her shoulders, protecting her from the cooling mountain air. The horse's hooves crunched steadily on the rocky ground as they climbed higher into the pine-covered hills. Robert walked beside them, his stride long and purposeful, scanning the trail ahead with watchful eyes. The silence between them stretched thick and heavy, broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the occasional snort from the horse. Michael opened her mouth several times to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Robert's quiet presence both reassured and unsettled her. His scarred face remained impassive, giving away nothing of his thoughts or intentions. "Thank you," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "For what you did back there." Robert gave a slight nod but kept walking, his eyes on the trail. The road wound higher into the hills, and the air grew cooler as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Pine needles crunched beneath Robert's boots, and the sweet scent of sap filled the air. Michael's back ached from hours in the saddle, but she didn't dare complain. Even this discomfort was better than the auction block's shame. As dusk approached, Robert led them off the main trail, following a smaller path that curved around a stand of aspens. He helped Michael down from the horse with strong, careful hands, then set about making camp with practiced efficiency. Soon, a small fire crackled in a circle of stones, its warmth welcome against the gathering chill. Robert moved with quiet purpose, hanging a battered pot over the flames and measuring out beans and coffee from his saddlebags. The familiar smell of cooking food made Michael's stomach growl, reminding her she hadn't eaten since the previous day. "Rest," Robert said, gesturing to a fallen log he'd dragged near the fire. His voice was rough from disuse, but not unkind. "You need it?" Michael settled onto the log, drawing his coat tighter around her shoulders. The baby shifted inside her, and she pressed a hand to the spot, a habit born of months spent talking to her unborn child when no one else would speak to her. Robert handed her a tin cup of beans and a piece of hardtack without ceremony. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, watching him through the firelight as he poured 2 cups of strong coffee. "My husband," she said suddenly, surprising herself. "Thomas? He was the railroad's bookkeeper." She swallowed hard, the words bitter as medicine. "He died 3 months ago. Fever took him quick." Robert's eyes met hers across the flames, steady and attentive. "The creditors came after that, said Thomas had been stealing, cooking the books." Her voice wavered. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know, but nobody believed me. They said I must have helped him." Robert nodded once, acknowledging her words without pressing for more. He added another stick to the fire, sending sparks swirling upward into the darkening sky. The night grew colder as full darkness settled over the hills. Coyotes began their eerie chorus in the distance, their yips and howls echoing off the mountainsides. Michael tensed at the sound, but Robert remained calm, his rifle resting across his knees as he kept watch. "Try to sleep," he said, pouring her another cup of coffee. "You're safe here." Michael arranged herself as comfortably as she could on the log, using Robert's coat as a blanket. The ground was hard beneath her, so different from her old bed in town, but exhaustion soon pulled at her eyes. The baby had settled, lulled perhaps by the gentle crackle of the fire and the distant song of night birds. Through half-closed eyes, she watched Robert's profile against the flames. His expression was distant, lost in thoughts she couldn't guess at. The firelight caught the scars on his face, throwing them into sharp relief. What battles had marked him so? What memories kept him out here in the wilderness, far from town and people? Sleep came in fits and starts. Each time she opened her eyes, Robert remained in the same position, vigilant and still. His rifle never left his hands, and his eyes constantly scanned the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. The last time she woke, she found him staring into the dying flames, his face haunted by shadows that seemed to come from within rather than without. There was a depth of pain in his expression that made her heart ache, though she didn't understand its source. She closed her eyes again, pulling his coat closer around her shoulders. Whatever demons pursued this quiet mountain man, whatever had led him to spend $1 to save a stranger, she was grateful. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something close to safe. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient paths, and the night wind whispered through the pines. Robert kept his lonely vigil, guarding against more than just coyotes and darkness, while Michael finally fell into a deeper sleep beneath his borrowed coat. Gray clouds hung low over the mountains as dawn broke, casting a dim light over the wilderness. Michael woke stiffly from her makeshift bed by the dead fire, her back aching from the hard ground. Robert had already packed most of their small camp, moving with the quiet efficiency she was beginning to recognize as his way. The morning passed in slow, steady travel upward through the pines. Robert led his horse along narrowing trails, sometimes having to clear fallen branches from their path. The altitude made Michael's breath come shorter, and she found herself grateful for the horse beneath her. By mid-afternoon, the trees had thinned, giving way to scattered stands of wind-twisted pines near timberline. The air grew sharper, carrying the bite of approaching winter. Through the gray light, Michael spotted a curl of wood smoke rising ahead, stark against the clouded sky. Robert guided them around a final bend, revealing a small clearing nestled against the mountainside. There, weathered but solid, stood a cabin built of rough-hewn logs. Its shake roof bore patches of moss, and a stone chimney rose from one end, wisps of smoke suggesting warmth within. "Your home?" Michael asked, her first words since morning. Robert nodded, helping her down from the horse. Her legs trembled from the long ride, and she steadied herself against his offered arm. He led her to the cabin's door while the wind whipped at their clothes. Inside, the cabin was spare, but surprisingly tidy. A stone hearth dominated one wall, its fire casting welcome warmth throughout the single room. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood beneath a small window, while shelves lined with dried goods and preserved foods spoke of careful preparation for winter. "You can rest there," Robert said, indicating a narrow cot in one corner, piled with clean blankets. The unexpected comfort of it brought tears to Michael's eyes. "Thank you," she managed, sinking onto the cot's edge. After days of uncertainty and fear, the simple offer of a proper place to rest overwhelmed her. Robert busied himself with settling in, hanging his coat, storing supplies, adding wood to the fire. His movements were practiced, speaking of years lived in this solitary place. Michael watched him, trying to reconcile this careful homekeeper with the scarred man who had thrown a silver dollar onto the auction block to save her. As evening drew closer, Robert set about preparing their supper. The familiar domestic sounds of cooking filled the cabin. The scrape of the pot, the crack of kindling added to the fire. Soon, the rich smell of venison stew filled the air, making Michael's stomach growl. They sat at the rough table, sharing fresh bread and the hearty stew. The food was simple but well prepared, speaking again to Robert's self-sufficiency. Michael ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware of the questions that had built up over their journey. Finally, warmed by food and fire, she found the courage to ask what she most needed to know. "Why did you help me?" she asked softly, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. "Back there, in town. Why spend even $1 on a worthless woman?" Robert's hands stilled on his own cup. For a long moment, he stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was rough with memory. "Had a wife once," he said. "Sarah, and a little girl, Mary." His fingers traced a pattern on the table's worn surface. "Lost them both 15 years ago, during the war." Michael's heart clenched at the pain evident in his voice. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Couldn't stand by," he continued, "watching them treat you like that, like you weren't even human, like you were livestock to be sold." His scarred face hardened at the memory. No woman deserves that. No person does. Tears stung Michael's eyes, understanding now that his act of rescue had sprung not from pity, but from a deep well of personal pain. She saw him differently, not just as her rescuer, but as someone who had suffered his own devastating losses. "What happened to them?" she asked gently, not sure if he would answer. Robert's gaze remained fixed on the fire. "Raiders came through our town. I was away, scouting for the Union Army." His voice grew distant. "By the time I got back, everything was gone. Everyone was gone." The weight of his words filled the cabin, mixing with the wind's moan outside. Michael's own grief for Thomas felt fresh again, recognizing in Robert the same hollow ache of loss she carried. As night settled fully over the mountain, Robert rose to bank the fire. Michael retired to the cot, pulling the blankets close around her. The baby shifted within her, active now as it often was at night. She lay awake, listening to the wind's song through the pines, wondering what tomorrow would bring in this quiet refuge. Across the room, Robert sat in his chair by the fire, a piece of wood and carving knife in his hands. The soft scrape of blade against wood joined the fire's crackle and the wind's whisper. Michael watched through half-closed eyes as his hands moved with careful precision, transforming the raw wood into something new. The cabin's warmth wrapped around her like a physical presence, so different from the cold streets of town where she'd faced such cruelty. Here, in this simple shelter built by a man who understood loss, she felt the first stirrings of real safety. Sleep came slowly, accompanied by the rhythmic sound of Robert's carving and the pop of settling logs in the fire. Outside, The wind continued its lonely song through the high mountain passes. But within the cabin's walls, 2 wounded souls had found, if not peace, at least a moment's respite from their separate sorrows. Morning light filtered through the cabin's small windows as Michael sat cross-legged on her cot, carefully unwrapping a bundle from her shawl. Her few possessions from town lay scattered around her: a worn dress, a hairbrush, and Thomas's old Bible. But it was this wrapped package that made her hands tremble. Robert stood at the hearth, stirring breakfast porridge when he noticed her hesitation. "Something troubling you?" he asked, his voice gruff but gentle. Michael took a deep breath. "There's something you should know," she said, pulling away the last layer of cloth to reveal a leather-bound ledger. "This belonged to Thomas, my husband." Robert set down the spoon and walked over, his brow furrowing as he studied the book in her hands. The leather was cracked but well cared for, its pages stuffed with loose papers and notes. "He worked as a bookkeeper for the railroad company," Michael explained, opening the ledger carefully. Inside, neat columns of numbers marched across the pages, accompanied by names, dates, and detailed notations about land surveys and water rights. "I never understood all of it, but Thomas, he said it was dangerous." Robert's weathered hands took the ledger, his eyes scanning the entries with growing concern. "These numbers don't match," he muttered, flipping through more pages. "And these land boundaries, they're all wrong." Michael nodded. Thomas started noticing discrepancies. The railroad was claiming more land than they had rights to, pushing out homesteaders and... She hesitated. "And the Ute people, too." Robert's face darkened as he continued reading. "This isn't just bad accounting," he said grimly. "This is proof of fraud. They're stealing land, manipulating water rights." He looked up at Michael. "Your husband was right. This could get someone killed. Thomas said if anything happened to him, I should keep it safe." Michael's voice quivered. "The night before he died, he was agitated, saying he had to make things right." Robert closed the ledger carefully. "This explains why they were so eager to get rid of you back in town. Did anyone know you had this?" Before Michael could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the morning quiet. Robert's head snapped up, his body tensing like a mountain cat sensing danger. "Get back," he ordered, moving swiftly to grab his rifle from its place by the door. "Keep that ledger close." Michael clutched the book to her chest, retreating to the corner farthest from the windows. Outside, horses circled the cabin, their riders' voices growing louder and more threatening. "Come on out, widow woman," a harsh voice called. "We know you've got Dawson's papers in there." Robert positioned himself by the window, rifle ready. "Back off," he shouted. "This is private property." Laughter echoed from outside. "That book is railroad property, mountain man." "Hand it over, and nobody needs to get hurt." Instead of answering, Robert fired a warning shot into the air. The horses whinnied in surprise, their riders cursing. A second shot kicked up dirt near one rider's horse, sending it rearing. "Next one won't miss," Robert called out, his voice cold and steady. There was a moment of tense silence, broken only by the snorting of nervous horses. Then the first voice spoke again, tight with anger. "This ain't over. That ledger belongs to the company, and we'll be back for it. Count on that." The sound of retreating hoofbeats filled the air as the riders pulled away, their threats hanging in the morning air like gun smoke. Michael remained frozen in the corner, her heart pounding, the ledger pressed against her chest as if it might protect her from the danger it represented. Robert waited until the sounds had completely faded before lowering his rifle. He moved quickly through the cabin, checking the windows and door. "They'll be back," he said grimly, "and next time they won't announce themselves so politely." Michael sank onto her cot, suddenly exhausted. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I've brought trouble to your door." Robert paused in his work of reinforcing the window shutters. "You didn't bring this trouble," he said firmly. "Those men and their railroad masters did that all on their own." He resumed his task, testing the strength of each board. But we need to be ready for them. The rest of the day passed in tense preparation. Robert showed Michael how to bar the door properly, where to hide if shooting started, how to signal him if she spotted riders approaching. As evening approached, he laid out extra ammunition and checked his rifle again. Michael watched him work, the ledger now safely hidden beneath her cot. The weight of its secrets seemed to press down on her like a physical burden. Her husband had died protecting this truth, and now she and Robert might face the same fate. As darkness fell, Robert lit a single lamp, keeping it away from the windows. The cabin felt smaller somehow, more confined, as if the walls themselves were drawing in for protection. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the newly reinforced shutters. "Try to rest," Robert told her, settling into a chair with a clear view of both the door and windows. "I'll keep watch." Michael nodded, though she doubted sleep would come easily. She lay down on her cot, one hand resting protectively over her swollen belly, the other touching the hidden ledger beneath. In the dim lamplight, she could see Robert's profile, stern and watchful, as he guarded their fragile sanctuary against the gathering night. The ledger's presence, once a burden of confusion, now felt like a burning brand marking them both as targets. Yet somehow, knowing Robert stood between her and those who would harm her, Michael felt a flutter of hope beneath her fear. Whatever came next, she was no longer facing it alone. Dark clouds rolled over the mountains, bringing with them a heavy stillness that pressed against the cabin windows. Robert stood in the doorway, studying the slate-gray sky with knowing eyes. "Big storm's coming," he said, his voice low. "Might last a couple days by the look of those clouds." Michael watched from inside as he strode to the woodpile, his movements quick and purposeful. The air felt thick, charged with the promise of rain. Her hands absently smoothed her apron over her swollen belly as Robert began stacking split logs by the door. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Michael moved to the hearth, threading a needle by the fire's light. She had noticed Robert's coat needed mending, the least she could do for the man who'd saved her. The familiar motion of needle and thread brought comfort as the first heavy drops began to fall outside. Robert carried in the last armload of wood just as the sky opened. Rain drummed against the roof, creating a steady rhythm that filled the cabin. He settled into his chair, watching Michael's careful stitches with quiet interest. "You're good with that needle," he observed after a while, breaking their usual silence. Michael managed a small smile. "My mother taught me, said a woman needs to know how to keep things whole." Her voice caught slightly on the word whole, and she paused in her sewing. Robert noticed her hesitation. "Something troubling you?" The thunder cracked louder, and Michael's fingers trembled slightly. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just of those men who might come back. She placed a hand on her belly. "I'm afraid of having this baby alone, of being unwanted. Both of us." Robert shifted in his chair, his scarred face softening in the firelight. "You won't be alone," he said firmly. "I gave my word to protect you, and that includes when your time comes." Tears welled in Michael's eyes, but she blinked them back. "Thomas, my husband, he wasn't a cruel man," she said, needing Robert to understand. "He was weak, is all." He knew what that ledger meant, knew the railroad was stealing land from honest folks and the Ute people. He wanted to make it right, but she shook her head. He lacked the courage. Rain lashed against the windows as Robert stared into the fire, something dark and distant crossing his face. "Courage isn't simple," he said finally. "I learned that in the war." Michael looked up from her sewing, surprised by this revelation. "You fought?" "Scouted for the Union Army," Robert replied, his voice growing rough with memory. "Saw things no man should see. Lost my wife and daughter while I was away." His hands clenched on the arms of his chair. "Lost my faith too, in men and God alike." A massive thunderclap shook the cabin, making the windows rattle in their frames. Michael set aside her sewing and folded her hands in her lap. Without hesitation, she began to pray aloud, her voice steady despite the storm's fury. "Lord, keep us safe through this storm," she said clearly. "Protect this cabin and those within it. Grant us strength to face whatever trials may come, and help us remember we're never truly alone." Robert didn't join in the prayer, but he watched Michael intently, something stirring behind his eyes. The storm raged outside, but in that moment, the cabin felt like a sanctuary of sorts. Not just from the weather, but from the larger storms they both faced. Hours passed as the rain continued. Michael returned to her sewing, and Robert carved quietly by the fire. Their silence now felt different, comfortable, almost peaceful. Occasionally they would share simple observations or memories, each careful revelation building a bridge between them. As evening approached, the storm began to ease. The thunder grew more distant, the rain softening to a gentle patter. Robert rose to check the windows and door, his movements protective rather than wary. Michael watched him, understanding growing in her heart. This scarred, silent man had suffered losses she could barely imagine, yet he'd chosen to help her, to shield her from those who would harm her. His lack of faith didn't make him less honorable. If anything, it made his protection more meaningful. He acted from conviction, not obligation. Robert returned to his chair, his expression thoughtful as he studied the dying fire. In the growing darkness, Michael could see the resolution settling over him like a mantle. He might not share her prayers, but he had made his own silent vow to protect her and her unborn child, whatever the cost. The storm that had trapped them inside had done more than test the cabin's strength. It had created a space for truth, for understanding, for the first tender shoots of trust to take root. As night fell, the rain finally stopped, leaving behind a changed atmosphere between them. No longer strangers thrust together by circumstance, but two wounded souls finding unexpected sanctuary in each other's presence. Morning sunlight filtered through the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floor. Robert stood at the hearth, pouring coffee into tin cups when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made him freeze. In one fluid motion, he set down the pot and grabbed his rifle. Michael pressed herself against the wall, one hand protectively over her belly. The hoofbeats grew closer, steady and unhurried. Robert moved to the window, rifle ready, then his shoulders visibly relaxed. "It's all right," he said, lowering his weapon. "It's Henry." The door opened, and a tall man in buckskins stepped inside. His dark eyes took in the cabin's interior with careful attention before settling on Robert. A slight smile crossed his weathered face. "Brother," Henry Tall Elk said warmly, clasping Robert's forearm in greeting. "It has been too long." Robert's usual stern expression softened. "Welcome, old friend." Henry turned to Michael, inclining his head respectfully. "I am Henry Tall Elk," he said, his voice carrying both dignity and kindness. "Robert and I scouted together in the war." Michael straightened, managing a small curtsy despite her condition. "I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Tall Elk. I'm Michael Dawson." "Just Henry," he said, then glanced at Robert with raised eyebrows. The silent question hung in the air. Robert gestured to the table. "There's coffee and things we need to discuss." They settled around the table, steam rising from their cups. Michael retrieved the ledger from its hiding place, handling it carefully as she set it before Henry. He opened it, his expression growing grave as he studied the cramped columns of numbers and names. "My husband," Michael said softly. "He kept this hidden. I never understood why until it got him killed," Henry finished, looking up from the pages. His eyes held a deep understanding. "This ledger, it tells a story of theft. The railroad company, they made false surveys, used them to take land that wasn't theirs to take. Robert leaned forward. How bad? Bad enough, Henry replied, turning pages slowly. Here, they moved boundary markers on settler ranches. Here, they claimed water sources that belonged to my people by treaty. Without these numbers, these names... He tapped the page. Without proof of the true surveys, both settlers and Ute lose their rightful claims. Michael's hand went to her throat. That's why Thomas hid it. He knew what it meant. Henry nodded solemnly. Your husband died protecting more than paper, Mrs. Dawson. He died protecting the truth. The weight of his words settled over the cabin. Robert stood, pacing near the fireplace. The marshal in Denver needs to see this. Yes, Henry agreed, but the journey is not safe. The railroad men, they will kill to keep these secrets buried. Michael's voice was steady, despite her fear. Then we must find a way. Thomas... She paused, gathering strength. Thomas died for this. We can't let that be for nothing. Robert turned, studying her with concern. You're in no condition to travel. The baby isn't due for weeks yet, she insisted. Henry watched their exchange thoughtfully. There may be a way, he said, but we will need time to plan. The railroad men are watching the main trails to Denver. Outside, a jay called harshly. Henry rose and checked the window, his movements silent despite his size. I should stay the night, he said. We can talk more when darkness gives us better cover. As evening approached, Michael prepared a simple supper of cornbread and beans. The men helped her gather extra firewood, their movements speaking of long practice working together. When night fell, they gathered around the hearth's warm glow. Henry shared stories of his people's struggles with the railroad's expansion, of broken promises and moved markers. Robert added tales of their scouting days, of trust forged in dangerous times. Michael listened, learning how these two men from different worlds had become brothers in all but blood. The old ones, Henry said, stoking the fire, they teach us that truth has its own power. Like water, it finds a way to flow where it must go. He looked at Michael. Your husband's courage preserved this truth. Now it falls to us to help it flow where it needs to be. Michael felt tears prick her eyes, but they were different from the desperate tears she'd shed in recent days. These felt like hope, fragile but real. Robert and Henry exchanged glances, years of shared experience allowing them to communicate without words. Their silent agreement was clear. They would find a way to get the ledger to Denver, to see justice done. As the fire burned low, their unlikely alliance took shape. A pregnant widow carrying proof of corruption, a hardened mountain man rediscovering purpose, a Ute scout fighting for his people's rights. 3 lives drawn together by a dead man's final act of conscience. Michael touched the ledger's worn cover, understanding at last the true weight of what Thomas had entrusted to her. In the morning, they would begin planning their dangerous journey. But for now, in the cabin's sheltering warmth, she felt stronger than she had in months. Henry spread his blanket near the fire, while Robert took his usual watch position. The night settled around them, full of possibilities and perils yet to come. But they would face them together, each bringing their own strength to the task ahead. The morning air bit sharp and cold as Robert helped Michael into the wagon's wooden seat. Henry had borrowed it from his cousin who lived in the next valley, along with 2 steady horses used to mountain trails. Thick blankets cushioned the rough boards, and Robert tucked another around Michael's shoulders. The road's icy, he said, checking the wheels. We'll take it slow. Michael nodded, pulling the blanket closer. Her breath clouded in the frigid air. The ledger lay hidden beneath the wagon's false bottom, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the weather. Henry mounted his paint horse, scanning the tree line with practiced eyes. Robert climbed onto the wagon seat beside Michael, taking up the reins. The horse's hooves crunched on frozen ground as they started down the mountain path. Henry rode ahead, alert for any sign of trouble. The journey stretched through the morning hours. The wagon creaked and swayed over rutted ground. Every jolt made Michael wince, though she tried to hide it. Robert noticed anyway, steering carefully around the worst spots. "You holding up?" he asked, after a particularly rough patch. "Yes," Michael said, managing a smile despite her discomfort. "I'm grateful for the wagon. Walking would have been—" She left the thought unfinished, one hand resting on her swollen belly. By midday, they stopped briefly to rest the horses and share a cold meal of jerky and hard biscuits. The sun hung pale in a steel-gray sky, offering little warmth. Henry disappeared into the trees, returning minutes later with fresh snow melted in his canteen. "Here," he said, offering it to Michael. "The little one needs water." She accepted gratefully, the icy liquid easing her parched throat. Robert stood apart, watching the road behind them. His rifle never left his hands. The afternoon wore on, marked by the steady clip-clop of hooves and the wagon's continuous creak. As they descended, the air grew slightly warmer, though patches of ice still glinted treacherously on the road. Pine forests gave way to scattered homesteads. Smoke rose from distant chimneys. Dusk was settling when they finally approached the town. Oil lamps glowed in windows, and a few people hurried along the boardwalks, heading home for supper. The wagon drew curious stares. Michael felt their eyes, heard the whispers start. "Ain't that the worthless widow? Look who's with her. The mountain man." Robert's jaw tightened, but he kept his gaze forward. Henry rode closer to the wagon, his presence a quiet warning to any who might cause trouble. They passed the general store where Michael had once been welcome, past the saloon where men gathered to drink and gossip. A few townspeople stopped to watch. Some faces showed mockery, others confusion. But there were also looks of sympathy, especially from the women. Mrs. Baker, the baker's wife, even offered a small wave. Michael felt tears threaten but held them back. She sat straighter, refusing to bow under their scrutiny. The church stood at the edge of town, its white painted walls gleaming in the last light. Reverend Callahan emerged as they approached, his kind face creased with concern. He hurried down the steps to meet them. "Welcome, welcome," he said softly, helping Michael down from the wagon. "Come inside, all of you. The evening service is long over. We'll have privacy." Inside, lamplight cast warm shadows on the wooden pews. The air smelled of beeswax candles and aging hymnals. Michael's legs trembled after the long ride. Robert steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow. Henry brought in the ledger, wrapped in its oilcloth covering. The Reverend examined it soberly when they explained its significance. "So this is what poor Thomas died protecting," he said, turning the pages carefully. "No wonder they wanted it destroyed." He looked up at them. "You were right to bring it here." "Can you keep it safe?" Robert asked. "Just until the marshal arrives?" Reverend Callahan nodded. "I know just the place." He went to the altar and pressed something beneath it. A small panel opened, revealing a hidden compartment. "The church has kept secrets before," he said, placing the ledger inside. "I'll guard it with prayer and my life if need be." "We're much obliged, Reverend," Henry said quietly. "No thanks needed. This is God's house, a place of truth and justice." He smiled at Michael. "You look weary, my dear. Rest here as long as you need." Michael sank onto a pew, relief washing over her. Robert touched her shoulder briefly, then turned to Henry. "We need supplies. Watch over her?" Henry nodded, settling into a shadowed corner where he could see both doors. Robert slipped out into the gathering darkness. Alone in the church's peace, Michael finally let her tears fall. She slid from the pew to her knees, hands clasped in prayer. "Thank you, Lord, for bringing us safe. Thank you for these good people. Thank you for hope." Reverend Callahan lit more candles, then retreated to his study, giving her privacy. Henry's presence remained, silent and protective. Outside, she could hear the night sounds of the town. Voices, horse hooves, a dog barking in the distance. But here, In this sacred space, she felt truly safe for the first time since Thomas died. Robert returned an hour later with supplies: food, blankets, medicines they might need. His quiet efficiency touched her heart. He had thought of everything, even a warm shawl for her. The church would be their sanctuary tonight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, Michael let herself rest in God's house, surrounded by those who had become her defenders. The ledger lay hidden beneath the altar, its truth waiting to be revealed. She prayed it would be enough to bring justice at last. The morning sun crept over the mountain peaks, painting the church steeple in soft gold. Robert stood behind the church, his axe rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Each blow sent wood chips flying as he split logs for the parsonage's dwindling woodpile. The familiar work eased his mind, though his eyes constantly scanned the quiet street. Inside the parsonage kitchen, Michael kneaded bread dough beside Reverend Callahan's wife, Sarah. The older woman had welcomed her warmly, showing her where to find flour and yeast. The kitchen was warm and fragrant with baking. "Thomas always said you made the best biscuits in town," Sarah said softly, patting Michael's hand. "I'm glad to have your help today." Michael's throat tightened at the kind words. She'd grown used to cold stares and whispers. "Thank you," she managed. "It feels good to be useful again." Through the window, she could see Henry speaking with Mr. Peterson, the dairy farmer. Their heads were bent close, voices low but animated. Other townspeople passed by, some stopping to listen. Henry's presence drew attention. It wasn't often a Ute Scout walked freely through town, but his dignified bearing and quiet words commanded respect. The morning wore on. Robert finished with the wood and began repairing loose boards on the church steps. The steady tap of his hammer joined the rhythm of daily life. Wagon wheels on dirt streets, children's voices from the schoolyard, the blacksmith's anvil ringing in the distance. Around noon, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Baker arrived carrying a covered basket. "Fresh bread," she announced, setting it on the kitchen table. "And some preserved peaches, too." She hesitated, then touched Michael's arm. "We should have spoken up sooner, dear. When they put you on that auction block." Michael blinked back tears. "You're speaking up now," she said softly. "That means everything." More visitors followed. Mr. Peterson returned with a jar of fresh milk and news that other farmers were questioning the railroad's land claims. The cooper's wife brought a warm shawl she'd been knitting. Even shy Miss Evans from the mercantile slipped in with a packet of tea. Robert watched from the doorway, his weathered face thoughtful. Michael moved among their visitors with quiet grace, her smile brightening the room. The fear that had haunted her eyes since the auction was fading, replaced by something stronger, dignity returning, like spring after a long winter. Henry joined them in the afternoon, bringing word from his conversations. "The people are listening," he said, accepting a cup of coffee. "Many lost land to the railroad's schemes. They were afraid to speak alone, but together." He gestured to the growing number of visitors. "Together they find courage." Sarah Callahan, seeing how many had gathered, suggested an impromptu supper in the church basement. "We have plenty of food now," she said, smiling at the donated offerings. "And these days we need fellowship more than ever." As evening approached, lanterns were lit in the basement. Tables were arranged, dishes shared, the space filled with the murmur of conversation and the clatter of plates. Michael found herself seated between Robert and Mrs. Baker, surrounded by neighbors who now met her eyes with warmth instead of judgment. Robert remained vigilant, his rifle propped against the wall behind him. Through the basement windows, he could see boots passing on the boardwalk, the sheriff's men keeping watch. But inside, the atmosphere was almost festive. Children played in the corners while their parents talked in low, determined voices about water rights and survey marks. "My grandfather homesteaded that creek," Mr. Peterson was saying. "Then suddenly the railroad claims they own it? Ain't right." Others nodded. Similar stories emerged: lost farms, diverted streams, forged documents. The ledger hidden beneath the altar held proof of it all. Near the end of the meal, Reverend Callahan stood and raised his hands for quiet. "Friends," he said, "in times of trouble we find strength in unity. Shall we lift our voices together?" He began the first notes of Amazing Grace. One by one, others joined in. Michael's clear soprano rose with Mrs. Baker's alto. The Cooper's deep bass rumbled beneath Sarah's gentle tenor. Even Henry hummed along, respecting their tradition while holding to his own. Robert didn't sing, but he watched Michael's face in the lamplight. Her eyes shone with unshed tears as she sang, one hand resting on her rounded belly. The simple melody filled the basement, trembling but growing stronger with each verse, like the town's awakening courage. Outside, the sheriff's men might watch and wait. The railroad's threats still hung over them like storm clouds. But in this moment, surrounded by neighbors who had chosen to stand with them, Michael felt something she had thought lost forever: the warmth of belonging, almost like family. As the hymn's last notes faded, she caught Robert's gaze. His usual stern expression had softened, just slightly, as he regarded her. She offered him a smile, and to her surprise, the corner of his mouth lifted in return. Through the basement windows, they could see the sheriff's men still lingering across the street. Robert's hand moved closer to his rifle, its presence a reminder that their safety was fragile. But tonight, at least, they were not alone. The town was awakening to the possibility of justice. One voice, one gesture, one act of kindness at a time. The moon hung like a silver dollar above the sleeping town when the first torch sailed through the church's stained glass window. Glass shattered with a musical tingle, followed by the whoosh of flames catching old wood. Robert, who had been dozing in a pew near the altar, jerked awake at the sound. "Fire!" His shout echoed through the sanctuary as orange light bloomed against the walls. More torches crashed through windows, their flames hungry for the dry timber. Outside, horses' hooves thundered on packed earth. Dark shapes moved in the firelight, the sheriff's men, at least 8 of them, surrounding the church. Sheriff Cutter's voice boomed through the smoke. "Burn it down! Don't let anyone near that ledger!" Robert sprinted for the altar where the precious book lay hidden. Smoke already filled the air, stinging his eyes. Behind him, the main doors burst open with a crash. Heavy boots stomped on wooden floors. Reverend Callahan appeared from his study, Bible in hand. "Stop this madness!" he commanded. 2 deputies grabbed him, fists flying. The preacher crumpled under their blows but didn't cry out. The flames spread quickly, racing up curtains and tapestries. Robert reached the altar and yanked open the hidden compartment, but Sheriff Cutter was faster. The big man's boot caught Robert in the ribs, sending him sprawling. Rough hands seized the ledger. "Finally," Cutter growled, stuffing the book into his coat. "Burn it all!" Robert launched himself at the sheriff, his war-trained instincts taking over. They crashed into a pew, trading fierce blows. But more deputies piled in, striking with clubs and rifle butts. Even Robert's strength couldn't match so many. Michael's scream pierced the chaos. She stood in the doorway, horror on her face as flames devoured the walls. "Robert!" He tried to break free, but a deputy's club caught him across the shoulders. Through streaming eyes, he saw Michael stumble backward as burning timbers crashed down near the entrance. Shouts erupted from outside. "Fire! The church is burning!" Townspeople emerged from their homes, filling the street. Henry Tall Elk's voice rose above the commotion, organizing men into a bucket line from the town well. Sheriff Cutter yanked Robert up by his shirt collar. "Stay down, mountain man, you've lost." He shoved Robert aside and bellowed to his men. "We're done here, mount up." The deputies released their hold on the beaten preacher and retreated through the smoke. Robert staggered to his feet, every breath painful from his bruised ribs. The sheriff and his men galloped away, the precious ledger disappearing into the night. Outside, the bucket line worked desperately. Water sizzled against burning wood, but the flames had too strong a hold. The church's roof groaned, timbers cracking like gunshots. "Michael?" Robert searched frantically through the crowd. He found her leaning against a hitching post, face contorted in pain. Her hands clutched her swollen belly. "The baby," she gasped. "Something's wrong." Her words cut off in a cry of agony as she doubled over. Robert caught her before she fell. Her face had gone pale as milk, beaded with sweat despite the cold night air. Another contraction seized her, forcing a whimper through clenched teeth. Henry appeared through the smoke, his dark eyes taking in the situation. "The ledger." "Can wait," Robert growled. "She needs help now." Henry nodded grimly. "The parsonage. Sarah Callahan knows what to do." Robert scooped Michael into his arms, trying to move smoothly despite his injuries. Behind them, the church's steeple swayed, then collapsed in a shower of sparks. The crowd scattered as burning debris rained down. Sarah Callahan met them at the parsonage door, her face smudged with ash but calm. "Bring her to the spare room. I've sent for Widow Jensen and Mrs. Baker. They've helped with many births." Robert laid Michael gently on the bed. She clutched his hand, tears streaming down her face. "Don't leave," she pleaded. "I'm here." He brushed damp hair from her forehead. "I'm not going anywhere." Sarah shooed him back as the midwives arrived. They bustled around Michael with cloths and water, their expressions grave as they checked her condition. Robert stood helplessly by the door, watching Michael writhe with each contraction. Henry touched his shoulder. "The church is lost," he said softly. "The bucket line couldn't save it." Robert's jaw clenched. The ledger was gone, their evidence destroyed. The sheriff had won. But when Michael cried out again, none of that seemed to matter. He'd failed to protect the proof of corruption, but he wouldn't fail her. Through the window, smoke and ash drifted like black snow. The night air carried the scent of burning wood and the murmur of shocked townspeople. But in the parsonage room, time stretched into an eternity of waiting as the midwives worked, and Michael fought through her labor. Sarah Callahan lit oil lamps as darkness deepened. Their gentle light cast long shadows on the walls. Outside, the last timbers of the church collapsed with a sound like distant thunder. Inside, Michael's breathing grew more labored, her grip on Robert's hand weakening. "Stay with me," he whispered, not sure if he was speaking to her or praying. "Stay strong." The night crawled forward, measured in Michael's pain and the midwives' worried whispers. Robert stood his vigil, ignoring his own injuries, holding onto her hand like an anchor in a storm. Henry kept watch by the door, his presence a silent comfort. Dawn was still hours away, but its promise felt distant and uncertain. In the smoky darkness, hope seemed as fragile as the ashes floating down from the ruined church. The ledger was lost, their evidence scattered, and Michael's life hung by a thread as delicate as her trembling fingers in Robert's grasp. Mrs. Baker approached with a damp cloth, her lined face full of concern. "The birth's coming too early," she murmured. "We must pray." Robert, who hadn't prayed since losing his family in the war, found himself mouthing words he thought he'd forgotten. Not for the ledger, not for justice, but for Michael, this brave woman who had awakened something in his hardened heart. The night settled deeper, heavy with smoke and sorrow, while they waited to see what morning would bring. Lamplight flickered across the parsonage walls as midnight crept toward dawn. The room felt close and warm, heavy with the scent of herbs Sarah Callahan had burned in a tin cup. Michael's labor pains came stronger now, each wave drawing a gasp from her pale lips. "That's it, dear. Breathe through it," Widow Jensen coached, her weathered hands steady as she pressed a cool cloth to Michael's forehead. The older woman's calm voice anchored the room despite the gravity of the situation. Robert hadn't moved from Michael's side in hours. His large, calloused hand enveloped hers, bearing her fierce grip without complaint. Though his ribs ached from the sheriff's beating, he focused only on Michael's face, watching for each flicker of pain. "Talk to me," Michael whispered between contractions. "Please, your voice helps." Robert cleared his throat, unused to such requests. "You're doing fine," he said gruffly. "Strong as mountain oak you are." The words felt awkward on his tongue, but Michael's grateful smile told him they helped. Henry Tall Elk stood sentinel by the window, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness beyond. Ash still drifted like gray snow, the air thick with smoke from the church's remains. Now and then, a timber would crack and fall, sending up a shower of sparks. "More towels," Mrs. Baker called softly. Sarah hurried to fetch them, her skirts rustling in the quiet room. The midwives exchanged worried glances. The baby was coming early, and Michael's strength was failing. Another contraction seized her. Michael cried out, her back arching off the bed. Robert found himself speaking without thought, words he hadn't used since the war. "Lord, give her strength," he murmured. The prayer felt strange, yet right, like finding an old trail marker in deep woods. Hours crawled past. The oil lamps burned lower, their golden light softening the shadows. Outside, a few townspeople still moved through the darkness, keeping vigil near the church's smoking ruins. Their quiet voices drifted up like a hymn. "The head's crowning," Widow Jensen announced suddenly. "Now, Michael, push with all you've got." Michael gathered her remaining strength, her face flushed with effort as she bore down. Robert supported her shoulders, letting her lean against him. "You can do this," he whispered. "Just a little more." The room held its breath. Even Henry turned from his watch, his usually stoic expression softening. Sarah knelt by the bed, her lips moving in silent prayer. Then, cutting through the pre-dawn stillness, came a new sound, high and clear and fierce. A baby's first cry split the air like summer lightning. Michael collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face as Mrs. Baker lifted the tiny, red-faced infant. "A girl," the midwife announced, quickly wrapping the baby in clean linens. "Small, but she's got good lungs on her." The news rippled through the room like sunshine. Sarah squeezed Michael's hand, murmuring thanks to heaven. Henry smiled, the first real smile Robert had seen from him in days. After the midwives cleaned and swaddled her, they placed the baby in Michael's trembling arms. She stared down at her daughter in wonder, counting tiny fingers, touching the wispy dark hair. "She's perfect," Michael whispered. "Oh, Robert, look at her." Robert found himself leaning closer, studying the small face. The baby's eyes were squeezed shut, her tiny fists waving in protest at the world. Something deep in his chest shifted, like ice breaking up in spring. "Would you like to hold her?" Michael asked softly. Robert hesitated. His hands felt too rough, too marked by violence for something so new and pure. But Michael was already lifting the bundle toward him, and he found himself carefully accepting the weight. The baby settled against his chest, surprisingly solid for something so small. She turned her face toward his heartbeat, and Robert felt tears sting his eyes for the first time since burying his own family. Here was hope, wrapped in cotton and sleeping in his arms. Dawn's first light began seeping through the windows, pale gray and smoke-tinged. Henry opened the shutters wider, letting in the morning air. The baby stirred, letting out another powerful wail that echoed across the town. Outside, voices rose in response. People emerged from their homes, drawn by the sound of new life. They gathered below the parsonage windows, their faces lifted toward the light. Someone started singing an old hymn, others joining in until the melody rose above the ash and ruin. "Listen," Michael said sleepily. "They're welcoming her." Robert nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. He gazed down at the child, then at Michael's tired smile, and felt something he thought long dead blooming in his heart. Faith, not just in God, but in the future. The sun climbed higher, its rays catching the drifting ash until it sparkled like snow. In the parsonage room, the baby slept peacefully, unaware that her first cry had already begun healing wounds deeper than the night's destruction. Sarah Callahan brought tea and bread, insisting Michael eat to keep up her strength. Henry finally relaxed his guard, accepting a cup with a grateful nod. The morning light grew stronger, revealing the church's blackened skeleton against the sky. But today, even that sight couldn't dim the joy radiating from the small room where new life had triumphed over loss. Morning sunlight filtered through the parsonage windows, casting warm squares on the rough wooden floor. Robert sat in a creaking rocking chair near the hearth, cradling the newborn with a gentleness that belied his scarred hands. The tiny girl slept peacefully, her face turned toward his chest, her breaths so soft he had to watch carefully to see them. Michael lay on the narrow bed across the room, her face still pale from the night's ordeal. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but her chest rose and fell in the steady rhythm of healing sleep. Sarah Callahan had insisted she stay in the parsonage until her strength returned. And for once, Robert was grateful for the town's help. Henry Tall Elk stood by the window, his expression grave as he watched the street below. Ash still dusted the ground outside, marking where the church had stood just yesterday. The sheriff's men had been spotted riding east at dawn, likely heading toward Denver with the stolen ledger. "They will cross Elk Creek by nightfall," Henry said quietly, turning from the window. "If we leave now, we could catch them before they reach the pass." His dark eyes met Robert's, urgent but understanding. Robert looked down at the sleeping infant, then at Michael's exhausted form. The choice before him felt like a physical weight on his chest. Chase down the sheriff, and the evidence that could bring justice to both settlers and Ute alike? Or stay here, protecting this fragile new family that somehow, against all odds, had become his responsibility? The baby stirred, making tiny mewling sounds. Robert adjusted his hold, marveling at how something so small could command such fierce protection in his heart. He had not held a child since. A floorboard creaked. Michael's eyes fluttered open, awareness returning slowly to her face. She had heard Henry's words. Robert could tell by the way her brow furrowed with concern. "Robert," she said softly, pushing herself up against the pillows. Her movements were careful, deliberate. "Come here, please." He rose slowly, mindful not to jostle the baby, and crossed to her bedside. Henry remained by the window, giving them space but staying close enough to hear. Michael reached for her daughter, and Robert gently transferred the sleeping infant to her arms. The child barely stirred, settling against her mother's warmth. Michael touched the baby's cheek with one finger, then looked up at Robert with clear eyes. "You're thinking of going after them," she said. It wasn't a question. Robert nodded, his throat tight. "That ledger, it's not just paper. It's people's lives, homes, water rights, everything your husband died trying to protect." "I know." Michael's voice was steady, despite her weakness. "But Robert, listen to me. Choose life first. Choose us, your family now if you'll have us." Her cheeks colored slightly at the bold words, but she didn't look away. Robert's heart thundered in his chest. Family. The word he'd forbidden himself to even think since the war took his first one. Yet here it was, offered freely, along with a future he'd never dared imagine. "The railroad can't be allowed to keep stealing," Michael continued, her voice growing stronger. "Not from the settlers, not from the Ute, but we need you alive to fight them." She reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. "Promise me you won't throw your life away for revenge." Henry stepped closer, his moccasins silent on the wooden floor. "She speaks wisdom, brother. We can pursue justice without sacrificing everything else." He touched the leather pouch at his belt, where he kept his own copies of treaties the railroad had broken. "There are other ways to fight." Robert looked between them. Henry's steady presence, Michael's fierce determination, the sleeping child who represented everything pure and possible. The anger that had driven him for so long began to shift, transforming into something more purposeful. "I promise," he said finally, squeezing Michael's hand. "No revenge, but we still need to stop them." Michael nodded, relief washing over her face. "Then make a plan, a smart one. Henry will help you." She lifted the baby slightly. "We'll be here when you return." The afternoon passed in careful preparation. Henry and Robert spread maps across the parsonage table, marking the sheriff's likely route and possible ambush points. They cleaned their rifles, checked ammunition, and packed light for speed. Sarah brought them food and coffee, her usual chatter subdued by the gravity of their task. As evening approached, Robert knelt beside Michael's bed. The baby was awake now, her dark eyes seemingly focused on his face. He touched her tiny hand with one finger, marveling when she gripped it with surprising strength. "I'll come back," he said softly. "You have my word." Michael reached up to touch his cheek, her fingers tracing the old scar there with tenderness instead of fear. "I know you will. God brought you to that auction block for a reason, Robert Hale. Our story isn't finished yet." Henry waited by the door, giving them this moment. Outside, 2 horses stamped impatiently, ready for the night's ride. The sun was setting, painting the ash-covered street in shades of gold and shadow. Robert stood, checking his rifle one last time. The weapon felt different now, not a tool of vengeance, but protection. Justice, not revenge. The distinction mattered. The baby made a small sound, drawing his attention back. Michael had settled her to nurse, the picture of peace despite their uncertain future. Something fierce and tender rose in Robert's chest, a feeling he thought he'd lost forever in the war. "We'll ride until moonset," Henry said quietly. "The sheriff's men will be camping by then. We can plan our next move from there." Robert nodded, shouldering his pack. He took one last look at Michael and the child, his family now, though he still marveled at the word. The choice was made. Whatever came next, he would face it with both justice and love in his heart. The room grew dim as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Michael's voice followed them out, soft but clear. "Be careful. Both of you." They mounted up, their horses' hooves muffled in the ash-covered street. Henry led the way east, toward the deepening shadows of evening. Behind them, through the parsonage window, Robert could see the gentle glow of lamplight where Michael sat with their daughter, keeping watch, keeping faith, giving him something precious to return to. The morning sun cast long shadows across the town square as people began to gather. Word had spread through the night like wildfire, whispers of the sheriff's betrayal, the burning church, and the stolen ledger. Farmers paused their work in the fields, miners emerged from their claims, and widows stepped out of their humble homes, all drawn by the growing murmur of resistance. Robert guided his wagon carefully along the rutted street. Michael sat propped against blankets in the back, cradling their sleeping newborn. Her face was pale but determined, dark circles under her eyes testament to her recent ordeal. The infant, wrapped snugly against the morning chill, made tiny sounds as the wagon rolled to a stop near the town square. Reverend Callahan stood on a wooden crate, his face bruised and swollen from the sheriff's men. His right eye was nearly closed, but his voice carried strong and clear across the gathering crowd. "Brothers and sisters," he called out, "we gather here today because silence serves evil. What happened at our church was more than just the burning of timber and stone. It was an attack on truth itself." Robert helped Michael from the wagon, supporting her weight as she stepped down carefully. The baby stirred but didn't wake, peaceful despite the tension in the air. Townsfolk parted to let them through, murmuring quietly at the sight of the young mother who had endured so much. Sarah Callahan hurried forward with a chair, positioning it near where her husband stood. "Here, dear," she whispered to Michael. "You shouldn't be standing yet." Michael sank into the chair gratefully, adjusting her hold on the baby. Robert stood behind her, one hand resting protectively on the back of her chair. His eyes scanned the crowd, noting familiar faces. The blacksmith with his soot-stained apron, old widow Jensen clutching her shawl, young Tommy Parker who helped at the livery stable. More townspeople arrived, drawn by the gathering. Soon nearly 100 people stood in the square, their faces a mix of uncertainty and determination. The Reverend raised his hands for quiet. "Mrs. Dawson has asked to speak," he announced. "She carries truth that must be heard." Michael handed the baby to Sarah, who cradled the infant close. With Robert's help, Michael stood, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each word. "My husband wasn't a perfect man," she began, "but he died trying to protect something important. The ledger he kept, the one Sheriff Cutter burned our church to destroy, contained proof of the railroad's crimes." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Michael continued, her words clear in the morning air. "They've been stealing land, not just from settlers, but from the Ute people, too. False surveys, forged documents, threats against anyone who spoke up." She pressed one hand to her side, steadying herself. "My husband knew the truth would get him killed." And it did. Gasps and angry mutters rose from the gathered townspeople. Robert watched faces change as understanding dawned. This wasn't just about one widow or one burned church. This was about all of them. "The sheriff," Michael's voice carried across the square, "is nothing but the railroad's hired gun. He burned God's house to hide their sins. He beat a man of God who dared to shelter truth." The Reverend stepped forward, his bruised face evidence of her words. "What was done in darkness must now face the light," he declared. "We cannot let fear rule us any longer." Robert moved to stand beside Michael, supporting her as her strength began to waver. He looked out at the faces before him. People he'd avoided for years, choosing solitude over community. Now he saw them differently. Slowly, deliberately, he unslung his rifle. The crowd tensed, but Robert knelt and laid the weapon on the ground before them. "True justice," he said, his deep voice carrying across the sudden silence, "doesn't come from this." He gestured to the rifle. "It comes from good people finding their courage, standing together, choosing right over fear." The silence held for a long moment. Then Old Man Thompson, who'd lost his ranch to the railroad's schemes, stepped forward. "The man speaks truth," he declared. "I'll stand with you." Widow Jensen raised her voice next. "My Jake died working their rails. Never got the pay they promised. I'll stand too." One by one, voices joined in. The blacksmith, the shopkeeper, the school teacher, farmers who'd lost water rights, miners cheated of their claims. Each voice added strength to the growing resolve. Michael swayed slightly, and Robert helped her back to her chair. Sarah returned the baby, who was beginning to stir. The infant's small sounds seemed to remind everyone what they were fighting for. Not just justice for the past, but hope for the future. The Reverend raised his hands again. "We need more than just words," he said. "We need action. Who will ride to Denver with evidence of the railroad's crimes? Who will testify before the territorial judge?" Hands raised across the crowd. Voices called out offering horses, supplies, shelter along the way. The blacksmith promised to guard families left behind. Widow Jensen offered her late husband's law books as evidence of property rights. Robert watched in amazement as the town transformed before his eyes. These weren't just scattered settlers anymore. They were becoming a community united in purpose. An older Ute man, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, stepped forward. "My people will help," he said in clear English. "We have our own records of broken promises. Together, we are stronger." Michael reached for Robert's hand, squeezing it tight. Tears shone in her eyes, but they were tears of hope now, not despair. The baby stirred again, and Michael adjusted her blanket, touching the tiny face with gentle fingers. "Look what you helped start," she whispered to Robert. He shook his head, still amazed. "No," he replied softly. "Look what you started. By refusing to be called worthless, by keeping faith when others lost hope." The morning sun climbed higher as plans took shape. Riders were chosen to carry messages to neighboring towns. Women organized supplies and safe houses along the route to Denver. Men volunteered for guard duties, protecting those who would testify. The Reverend's wife brought out paper and ink, recording names and promises. "Let it be written," she declared, "so none can deny what we choose this day." Robert watched it all, his hand still on Michael's shoulder. The rifle lay forgotten at his feet, a symbol of the old way giving way to something new. The baby slept peacefully in Michael's arms, untouched by the gravity of decisions being made around her. The gathering continued through the morning, people coming and going, but the core group remaining steady. Children played at the edges of the crowd, while their parents planned and promised. Even the town drunk stood quietly attentive, his usual flask nowhere in sight. Near noon, the Reverend called for prayer. Heads bowed across the square, settlers, miners, natives, all united in seeking divine guidance for the path ahead. Michael's clear voice led them in a hymn of courage, the words floating out across the town like a declaration of hope. When the song faded, the Reverend spoke one final time. "Let it be known," he declared, "that this day we chose truth over fear, community over corruption, justice over vengeance. May God and good people stand witness to our resolve." The crowd began to disperse, but not in fear or hiding. They moved with purpose now, each person carrying a piece of the larger plan. The square slowly emptied, but the spirit of unity remained, as tangible as the morning sun. Robert helped Michael back to the wagon, careful of her still healing body. The baby had awakened, making small, hungry sounds. Sarah brought them fresh water and bread, fussing over Michael's comfort for the ride home. As Robert climbed onto the wagon seat, he looked back at the town square. Where just days ago he had cut Michael free from the auction block, now stood the beginnings of true freedom, not just for one woman, but for an entire community finding its voice. The wagon wheels creaked as they started the slow journey back to the parsonage, where Michael would continue to recover. But now they moved through a different town, one awakening to its own strength, its own possibility for justice. Behind them, the sound of hammers rang out as men began clearing the burned church site. Not in defeat, but in preparation for rebuilding. The morning's gathering had sparked more than just words. It had kindled the flame of hope itself. The first light of dawn painted the Colorado sky in streaks of pink and gold. Townspeople gathered in the square, their faces set with determination. Some carried rifles, others clutched farming tools. Women stood shoulder to shoulder with their men. Even children watched from windows, sensing the weight of the moment. Robert stood at the front of the crowd, his rifle left behind as promised. Michael sat in the wagon just behind him, cradling her newborn daughter. Henry Tall Elk stood nearby, his presence a bridge between two worlds seeking justice. The thunder of hoofbeats broke the morning silence. Sheriff Cutter rode in with 6 armed men, their horses kicking up dust as they entered the square. The sheriff's bulk settled heavily in his saddle as he surveyed the crowd, his lip curling in a sneer. "Well, ain't this touching?" Cutter's voice boomed across the square. "The whole town turned out to watch me shut down this little rebellion." He reached into his coat and pulled out the ledger, its edges blackened from the church fire. He waved it mockingly above his head. "You all want this so bad?" He laughed, harsh and ugly. "Come and take it." Robert stepped forward, his hands empty and visible. "It's over, Cutter," he said. his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "That ledger belongs to the people you stole from." The sheriff's face darkened. "You threatening me, Mountain Man? Might want to count the guns pointed your way?" "I see them," Robert replied steadily. "I also see 200 townspeople who ain't afraid of you anymore." Movement caught Robert's attention. Michael was rising from the wagon, Sarah helping her stand. Though pale from childbirth, she drew herself up straight. "I have something to say," she called out, her voice stronger than anyone expected. The sheriff turned his horse toward her. "Sit down, woman. You're still property under the law until them debts are paid." "I am no man's property." Michael's words rang across the square. "And I aim to testify about what you did." She took a shaking step forward, then another. "My husband kept that ledger because he knew the truth. The railroad's been stealing land through false surveys. You helped them do it, taking bribes to look the other way." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Michael continued, her voice gathering strength. "You burned God's house trying to destroy the evidence. You beat a preacher of the Lord, but that ledger you're holding proves every crime, yours and the railroad's both." Henry Tall Elk moved forward then, his presence commanding attention. "That book also shows how you cheated my people," he declared. "The water rights you stole, the grazing lands you seized, all recorded in those pages. The Ute Nation demands justice." The sheriff's face had grown red with rage. "You letting an Indian dictate terms now?" He snarled at the crowd. "This territory belongs to progress, to the railroad, to men strong enough to take what they want." "No," Robert's voice cut through the morning air. "It belongs to the people. All the people." He took another step forward. "Your kind of progress is built on lies, Cutter. Built on stealing from widows and beating holy men. That ain't strength. It's cowardice wearing a badge." The sheriff's hand dropped to his revolver. "That's enough," he roared. "I'm the law here." The sound of rifles being cocked rippled through the crowd. Farmers raised their shotguns, miners leveled their revolvers. Even the women had kitchen knives and rolling pins at ready. Cutter's deputies looked nervously at the sea of armed townspeople surrounding them. One by one, they began backing their horses away from their leader. "Jones! Martinez! Get back here, you cowards!" Cutter shouted as his men retreated. "It's over, Sheriff," Robert said quietly. "You're surrounded by real law now. The law of people standing together." Cutter's face twisted with fury. His revolver cleared its holster with shocking speed, aiming straight at Robert's chest. But before he could fire, a dozen rifles snapped up. The sheriff found himself staring down a wall of gun barrels. His deputies were gone, leaving him alone against the town he'd terrorized for so long. "Last chance, Cutter," Robert warned. "Surrender the ledger and face proper justice." The sheriff's eyes darted wildly, looking for escape. Finding none, he did the only thing a coward could. He turned his gun toward Michael. "Back off or the widow gets it!" he screamed. The crowd surged forward as one. Old Man Thompson's rifle cracked, sending Cutter's revolver spinning from his hand. The blacksmith and 3 miners dragged the sheriff from his saddle. He hit the ground hard, the ledger tumbling from his coat. Henry snatched up the book while Robert planted a boot firmly on Cutter's chest. The former sheriff wheezed, all his bluster gone. "Somebody fetch some rope," Robert called out. "We'll need to tie him proper for his trip to the territorial marshal." Widow Jensen hurried forward with hemp cord from her shop. As they bound the sheriff's hands, Michael approached slowly, supported by Sarah. She looked down at the man who had tried to destroy her life. "You called me worthless," she said softly. "But God had other plans. He sent good people to stand with me, to stand for truth." The sheriff spat curses, but his words held no power anymore. 2 farmers dragged him to the jail he had once commanded, locking him in his own cell. Henry examined the ledger carefully. "The pages are scorched," he reported, "but the writing is clear enough. Every crooked deal, every stolen acre, it's all here." Robert nodded grimly. Enough to hang him proper in a court of law." The crowd began to disperse, but there was no celebration. They had won their town back, but the victory was solemn. Justice had been served, but there was still much healing ahead. Michael swayed slightly, and Robert was instantly at her side. "You need rest," he said gently, helping her back to the wagon. "We all do," she replied, settling carefully beside her sleeping daughter. "But first we need to make sure that ledger gets to Denver. The territorial marshal needs to see it." Henry mounted his horse. "I will ride with it," he declared. "My people have waited long enough for justice. I will see it done." Robert helped Sarah climb up beside Michael. "Get them home safe," he told the older woman. "I'll help Henry gather what he needs for the journey." The morning sun climbed higher as the town slowly returned to its routines. But everything had changed. Where fear once ruled, courage had taken root. Where greed had flourished, justice now grew stronger. The sheriff's reign of terror was over. The ledger's truth would soon be known in Denver. And in this small Colorado town, settlers and Ute alike had found something precious: the power of standing together against corruption. Robert watched the wagon carrying Michael and her child roll carefully toward the parsonage. The past few weeks had transformed them all. A worthless widow had shown them the worth of courage. A reclusive mountain man had rediscovered the value of community, and a town had awakened to its own strength. Henry appeared beside him, the precious ledger secured in his saddlebag. "You have chosen a good woman," he said quietly. Robert nodded, surprising himself with a small smile. "Reckon she chose me," he replied. "Chose all of us, when she decided to stand and fight." The morning breeze carried the scent of pine from the mountains. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, its clear tone speaking of hope and renewal. The confrontation was over. Justice had turned. And in its wake, something new was beginning. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town square as hoofbeats echoed down the main street. A group of riders approached, their badges glinting in the golden light. At their head rode United States Marshal Whitaker, his weathered face stern beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Robert stood straighter, recognizing the authority the marshal carried. Beside him, Michael sat in a rocking chair borrowed from the parsonage, her newborn daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. Henry Tall Elk remained close, his presence a bridge between two worlds seeking justice. The marshal dismounted, his spurs jingling against the wooden walkway. He surveyed the scene, the remnants of the burned church, the gathered townspeople, and the determined faces that met his gaze. "I received your telegram about Sheriff Cutter," Marshal Whitaker announced, his voice carrying across the square. "Where is he?" "Locked in his own jail," Robert replied, stepping forward, along with evidence of his crimes. The marshal's deputy led several more lawmen towards the jailhouse, while Whitaker approached Robert and the others. His eyes fell on Michael and the infant, then shifted to Henry, noting the unusual alliance before him. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat to Michael. "I understand you've been through quite an ordeal." Michael adjusted her shawl, holding her daughter closer. "We all have, Marshal. This town has suffered under corruption for too long." Reverend Callahan stepped forward, his face still bearing bruises from the sheriff's attack. "The railroad's men burned my church trying to destroy the evidence, Marshal, but God's providence preserved what was needful." Henry produced the ledger from his saddlebag, handling it with care. The pages were singed around the edges, but the damning entries remained clear. Every false survey, every stolen acre, both from settlers and my people, it's all recorded here. Marshal Whitaker took the ledger, his expression growing grimmer as he paged through it. The afternoon light caught the neat columns of numbers, the careful notes, the proof of years of systematic theft and fraud. "This is thorough," he said finally, closing the book. "Names, dates, amounts paid. Your late husband kept detailed records, Mrs. Dawson?" He died protecting that truth, Michael replied softly, tears gathering in her eyes. I reckon he knew its worth, even if he lacked the courage to act on it while he lived. Robert moved closer to Michael's chair, his presence protective and steady. The whole town knows the truth now, Marshal. We aim to see justice done, proper justice, through the law. The Marshal nodded slowly, tucking the ledger into his coat. You'll have it. This evidence, combined with sworn testimony, will be enough to prosecute both Cutter and his railroad masters. A murmur of relief rippled through the gathered crowd. Sarah Jensen, who had helped deliver Michael's baby, wiped tears from her weathered cheeks. The blacksmith removed his cap, muttering a quiet prayer of thanks. The territorial court will want statements from witnesses, Marshal Whitaker continued. Mrs. Dawson, your testimony about your husband's death and the sheriff's threats will be crucial. Michael straightened in her chair, her voice clear despite her exhaustion. I'll testify to every detail, Marshal, and I thank God for preserving not just the evidence, but our lives to speak the truth. The baby stirred then, letting out a small cry. Michael soothed her, humming softly. The Marshal's stern expression softened slightly at the sight. New life, he observed, born in the midst of all this trouble. Born of courage, Robert added quietly, like justice itself sometimes is. Henry stepped forward, his bearing dignified. The Ute Nation will also speak, Marshal. Our treaties were violated, our waters stolen. We seek restoration through your courts, not violence. Marshal Whitaker met Henry's gaze with respect. Your testimony will carry weight, Mr. Tall Elk. The territorial judge has a record of upholding Indian rights when evidence supports the claim. From the direction of the jail came the sound of struggling and cursing. The deputies were leading out Sheriff Cutter, now properly shackled. The former lawman's face was a mask of impotent rage as they helped him mount a horse. You're all fools, he spat. The railroad will crush you. You think one ledger can stop progress? It ain't about stopping progress, Robert called back. It's about making sure progress includes justice, for everyone. The Marshal's men secured Cutter between their horses. The once mighty sheriff looked small now, his badge gone, his power broken by the unity of those he had wronged. Marshal Whitaker turned to address the crowd. I promise you all, this evidence will be presented to the territorial court within the week. The railroad's crimes will be exposed, and restitution will be ordered where the law demands. A cheer went up from the townspeople. Women embraced, men shook hands, and children danced in the street. Michael bowed her head, tears flowing freely now as she whispered words of gratitude. Robert watched her, his own heart full of emotions he had thought long buried. The past weeks had changed him, awakened something he had believed dead since the war. Beside him, Henry gripped his shoulder in a gesture of brotherhood that transcended the boundaries between their peoples. You have done well, my friend, Henry said softly. Both our peoples will remember this day. The Marshal mounted his horse, the ledger secure in his saddlebag. His deputies formed up around Cutter, ready to escort their prisoner to Denver for trial. Mrs. Dawson, Whitaker called down. Get strong again. The court will need you soon. Michael nodded, holding her daughter close. I'll be ready, Marshal. We all will. As the lawmen rode out with their prisoner, the townspeople began to disperse. But they moved differently now, heads held higher, steps more certain. They had stood together against corruption and won. Justice had been restored not through gunfire or vengeance, but through courage and unity. Robert helped Michael rise from her chair. You need rest, he said gently. We all do, she replied, leaning against him slightly. But first, I want to thank God properly. Together they walked to where the church had stood. Though the building was gone, the ground was no less sacred. Michael handed the baby to Robert, who cradled her with surprising tenderness, while Michael knelt in the ashes. Thank you, Lord, she prayed aloud, her voice carrying on the afternoon breeze. For bringing justice through unity, for sending protectors when I was helpless, for preserving truth when all seemed lost. Henry stood respectfully to one side, his own prayers rising silently to the Creator. The baby cooed softly in Robert's arms, reaching up to touch his scarred face with tiny fingers. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of hope. The marshal's dust had settled, leaving behind a peace that felt both hard-won and lasting. Justice had been declared not just by law, but by the courage of ordinary people standing together. Michael rose from her prayers, brushing ash from her skirts. She looked at Robert holding her daughter, at Henry's steadfast presence, at the town that had become family. In her heart, she knew that while the legal battles might lie ahead, the victory that mattered most had already been won. They had chosen truth over fear, unity over division, and courage over despair. And in doing so, they had found something precious, a justice that could heal rather than wound, that could build rather than destroy. The evening wind carried the scent of pine from the mountains and the promise of tomorrow. Against all odds, they had prevailed. The ledger would speak its truth in Denver's courts, and this small Colorado town would never be the same. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mountain trail as Robert's wagon creaked slowly homeward. Michael sat beside him, cradling her newborn daughter wrapped snugly in a soft blanket the town women had sewn. The baby slept peacefully, her tiny face serene despite the wagon's gentle rocking over the rutted path. Henry Tall Elk rode alongside them on his paint horse, his presence a comfort as they left the town's boundaries behind. The events of the day had left them all weary but fulfilled. The weight of injustice finally lifted from their shoulders. "The Creator smiled on us today," Henry said, breaking the contemplative silence. "Justice came without bloodshed." Robert nodded, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "Reckon some battles are won better with truth than bullets." Michael gazed down at her sleeping child, her voice soft with wonder. "God's mercy shows up in the strangest ways. A month ago, I was bound to that auction block. Now ... She trailed off, overcome with emotion. The wagon rolled past stands of aspen trees, their leaves shimmering gold in the fading light. Henry drew his horse to a halt at a fork in the trail, one path leading toward the Ute camps in the higher valleys. "This is where I leave you, my friends," he said, touching his chest in farewell. "The elders will want to hear of today's victory." Robert pulled the wagon to a stop. "Much obliged for everything, Henry. Couldn't have done it without you." "You are welcome in my lodge anytime, brother." Henry's gaze moved to Michael and the baby. "And your family, too." Michael's heart warmed at the word family, though she tried not to read too much into it. "Thank you, Henry, for helping us find justice." Henry's eyes crinkled with a knowing smile. Justice found its way because hearts were ready to receive it. He touched his heels to his horse's flanks, turning toward the mountain trail. "Peace go with you both." They watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the backdrop of pine-covered slopes. When he disappeared around a bend, Robert clicked to the horses, and the wagon resumed its journey toward his cabin. The remainder of the trip passed in comfortable silence. Michael found herself studying Robert's profile in the golden evening light. The strong line of his jaw, the old scars that spoke of battles fought, the gentle way he handled the reins. So much had changed since that terrible morning at the auction block. As they approached the familiar clearing, Robert's cabin looked different to Michael's eyes. No longer a stranger's refuge, it now felt like the promise of home. Smoke curled from the chimney. Henry had ridden ahead earlier to light the fire before joining them in town. Robert helped Michael down from the wagon, careful of her still healing body and the precious bundle in her arms. Inside, the cabin was warm and welcoming, the hearth crackling with fresh split pine. "You sit and rest," Robert said, pulling out the rocking chair he'd positioned near the fire. "I'll see to supper." Michael sank gratefully into the chair, her body reminding her that she'd given birth just days ago. The baby stirred, making small mewing sounds that filled the cabin with new life. Robert moved about the kitchen with surprising grace for such a large man, preparing a hearty stew from venison and dried vegetables. The domestic sounds of knife on cutting board and spoon against pot created a soothing rhythm. "What shall you name her?" Robert asked suddenly, glancing over his shoulder. Michael looked down at her daughter's face, so perfect and new. "I've been thinking on that. Maybe Hope, after all we've been through?" "Hope," Robert repeated softly, testing the word. "It fits her." The baby opened her eyes at the sound of their voices, and to Michael's amazement, she smiled. Her first real smile. A laugh escaped Michael's lips, bright and unexpected. Robert turned from the stove, startled by the joyful sound. His face softened as he watched Michael with the baby, and something shifted in his heart. This was what his cabin had been missing all these years: laughter, life, family. He stirred the stew one final time, then wiped his hands on a cloth. His movements became hesitant, almost shy as he approached the rocking chair. "Michael," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "these past weeks having you here, it's changed things." She looked up at him, her heart beating faster. "Changed things? This cabin's been just shelter for a long time, somewhere to keep the rain off." He gestured at the rough-hewn walls. "But now, with you and Hope here, it feels like it could be more." Michael held her breath, hardly daring to hope. "I ain't much for fancy words," Robert continued, "but I reckon what I'm trying to say is, would you consider staying, making this a real home? The three of us?" Tears spilled down Michael's cheeks as she smiled up at him. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, we'll stay." Hope chose that moment to fuss, her small cries filling the cabin. Robert reached down, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he lifted her. "Shh, little one," he murmured, cradling her against his chest. "You're home now. We all are." Michael watched in wonder as the baby settled immediately in Robert's arms, tiny fingers curling around one of his calloused digits. The sight of this strong, quiet man holding her daughter with such tenderness made her heart overflow. The stew bubbled on the stove, filling the cabin with savory aromas. Outside, the sun had set, painting the sky in deep purples and blues. Through the window, the first stars were beginning to appear. Robert swayed slightly, rocking Hope as he gazed down at her face. "Never thought I'd hold another child," he said softly. "Not after what happened in the war." Michael rose from the rocking chair, moving to stand beside him. "God has a way of bringing new beginnings when we least expect them." He looked at her then, his eyes full of emotion. "Reckon he does at that." The lamplight cast a warm glow across the cabin's interior, softening the rough edges of furniture and walls. Hope made a contented sound, drifting back to sleep in Robert's secure embrace. This was what healing looked like, Michael realized. Not the absence of past hurts, but the courage to embrace new joy. She and Robert had both carried deep wounds, hers from shame and abandonment, his from loss and solitude. But somehow, through God's providence and their own halting steps toward trust, those wounds were becoming the foundation for something beautiful. Hope slept peacefully as Robert carefully placed her in the cradle he'd crafted during their days waiting for the marshal. Michael touched his arm gently, and together they stood watching their daughter. For that's what she had become to both of them now, sleeping in the lamplight's gentle glow. The evening settled around them like a blessing, transforming the simple cabin into something sacred, a home where love was choosing to take root and grow. Snow drifted silently past the cabin windows, adding to the thick white blanket that already covered the valley. Inside, the hearth fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows across rough-hewn walls. The steady rhythm of Robert's carving knife filled the small space as he worked, his powerful hands moving with surprising delicacy over the wooden cradle taking shape beneath them. Beads of sweat dotted his forehead despite the winter chill. He paused to wipe them away with his sleeve, studying the curved headboard with critical eyes. The piece needed to be perfect. Not just serviceable, like the temporary cradle he'd hastily built weeks ago, but something worthy of passing down through generations. From her rocking chair by the fire, Michael's soft voice rose in gentle song. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. She held Hope close as she nursed, the baby's tiny hand curled against her mother's chest. The hymn's familiar words filled the cabin with peace. Robert's knife resumed its steady work, unconsciously keeping time with Michael's singing. He'd chosen the wood carefully, a solid piece of cherry, salvaged from a lightning-struck tree near the creek. The rich red grain would polish up beautifully, he reckoned, smooth as silk under his hands. The baby finished nursing and Michael adjusted her shawl, lifting Hope to her shoulder for burping. "She's growing stronger every day," she said, pride warming her voice. "The Lord has truly blessed us." Robert looked up from his work, his expression softening as he watched them. Amazing how natural Michael looked now, handling the baby with quiet confidence. Those first desperate days after the church burning seemed like a distant memory. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Both of them tensed. Old habits died hard, but relaxed at the familiar pattern of raps. "Come in, Henry," Robert called. The door swung open, bringing a swirl of snowflakes and the broad figure of Henry Tall Elk. He stamped his boots carefully on the threshold, brushing snow from his shoulders. A cloth-wrapped bundle hung from one hand. "Brother," he greeted Robert with a nod. "Sister Michael." His weathered face creased in a smile as he approached the rocking chair. "And little one, she grows like a spring sapling." Michael beamed at the comparison. "She does at that. Here, would you like to hold her while I fix some coffee?" Henry accepted the baby with practiced ease, speaking soft words in Ute as he cradled her. Hope gurgled, reaching for the silver bear claw pendant that hung at his throat. "I bring news," Henry said, gently redirecting Hope's grasp to his finger instead. "And food, smoked venison from the last hunt." He set the wrapped bundle on the table. "Much obliged," Robert said, setting aside his carving knife. "How fare things with your people?" Henry's expression brightened. "The marshal has been true to his word. The railroad's false surveys are being thrown out. Both Ute lands and settler claims are being restored according to the original boundaries." Michael paused in her coffee-making, eyes shining. "Praise God! Then your people's water rights." "Will be honored, yes." Henry smiled. "The spirits of earth and water are pleased. And in town," he continued, "the people have begun rebuilding the church." "Truly?" Michael asked, hope lighting her face. Henry nodded. "I passed through yesterday. The foundation is larger than before. The mason says they're using stone this time. No one will burn it again." Robert grunted approval, running a hand over the cradle's smooth curve. "Good. Town needed something to unite around." "They speak often of you both," Henry said, "how your courage helped them find their own." He looked down at Hope, who had drifted to sleep in his arms. "This little one has many aunts and uncles now, though she does not know it." Michael blinked back tears as she poured coffee into tin cups. The memory of that terrible auction day still haunted her sometimes. The jeers, the shame, the placard declaring her worthless. To think those same townspeople now claimed her as family. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she said softly, passing Henry a cup. The afternoon light began to fade as they talked, sharing news and memories over coffee and Michael's fresh bread. Henry told stories of his people's winter celebrations, making them laugh with tales of young warriors' mishaps in the snow. Robert spoke of the elk herd he'd spotted in the high meadow, promising to take Henry hunting when spring came. As dusk deepened outside the windows, Robert returned to his work with renewed vigor. The cradle was nearly finished now, just needing final touches on the rockers. His knife moved surely, shaving paper-thin curls of wood that caught the firelight like copper. Michael prepared supper, the familiar scents of beans and cornbread mixing with the sharp cedar smell of woodworking. Henry helped her, showing her how his people seasoned venison with wild herbs. Hope slept peacefully in her temporary cradle, undisturbed by the quiet bustle. Finally, Robert set down his knife and ran his hands over the completed cradle one last time. Satisfaction showed in the set of his shoulders as he lifted it carefully, carrying it to the hearth. "It's beautiful," Michael breathed, taking in the smooth curves and delicate carved details, tiny leaves and vines winding along the headboard. "Fine work, brother," Henry agreed, admiration clear in his voice. "A cradle worthy of chiefs." Robert ducked his head at the praise, but pleasure showed in his eyes. Without ceremony, he lifted the sleeping Hope and placed her gently in her new bed. The cradle's runners settled perfectly on the plank floor, allowing it to rock with the slightest touch. They gathered around the table for supper, the rich smell of Henry's smoked venison making their mouths water. Michael had added the meat to her beans, along with the last of her dried corn. The combination made a feast fit for the celebration this evening had become. Henry spoke a blessing in Ute, touching his heart in thanks. Robert bowed his head, and Michael noticed his lips moving silently in prayer, something that would have been unthinkable just months ago. Laughter came easily as they ate, the warm food and fellowship chasing away winter's chill. Stories flowed like the coffee Michael kept pouring. Tales of hunting mishaps, Henry's grandfather's wisdom, Michael's childhood adventures. Even Robert, usually so reserved, shared a funny story about his first attempt at building furniture. Hope woke briefly, demanding attention. As Michael nursed her, the men's conversation turned to spring planting. Robert spoke of expanding the vegetable patch, while Henry offered advice about native plants that grew well in the valley. The baby drifted off again, and Michael placed her in the new cradle. Its gentle rocking seemed to deepen her sleep. Tiny fingers curled in perfect peace. Night pressed against the windows now, but inside the cabin, all was warm and bright. The fire painted everything in shades of gold. The rough table with its empty plates, Henry's silver pendant, Robert's strong hands relaxed in his lap, Michael's hair glowing like a halo. The cradle rocked softly in the firelight, its shadows dancing on the wall. More than just a piece of furniture, it had become something sacred, a symbol of all they had found here. Like the new church rising from ashes in town, like the justice restored to both settlers and Ute, like the family forged between these cabin walls, it spoke of hope renewed and faith reborn. Michael's quiet voice rose again in song, the old hymn speaking their hearts. Through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. Henry hummed along, adding a deep harmony, while Robert listened in peaceful silence. Outside, snow continued falling, wrapping their mountain home in pristine white. The cradle rocked, gentle as a heartbeat, steady as love, marking time in the firelit peace of their frontier home. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.